Welcome back. If you are joining us today, you are likely here with a very specific, highly focused purpose in mind.
You might be a medical student staring down the barrel of your pathology exams.
Right, or a junior doctor trying to solidify your practical understanding of medico-legal principles.
Or perhaps a senior clinician just looking to refresh those foundational concepts of forensic medicine.
Exactly. Whoever you are and whatever professional or academic requirement brought you to this deep dive, you are in exactly the right place.
You really are.
Our mission today is strictly guided by the foundational text of Chapter 5 of Simpson's Forensic Medicine.
Which is an absolute cornerstone text.
It is, and its focus is entirely on the appearance of the body after death. Okay, let's unpack this. Our core thesis for this deep dive is a concept that kind of challenges how we typically think about mortality.
It really reframes the whole idea of what death actually is from a biological standpoint.
Right, because once the mechanism of life ceases, biology itself does not simply stop.
No, it doesn't.
It continues, just in a radically different form. The body transforms into this silent, incredibly complex record, and time begins to write its signature upon it.
And the overarching reality we must face in forensic pathology is that reading this biological signature of time is, well, it's fraught with immense, sometimes overwhelming difficulty.
Because it's not just a ticking clock.
Exactly. Determining the post-mortem interval, commonly referred to as the PMI, is a process absolutely saturated with variables. There is no simple mechanical clock that starts ticking the moment a human heart stops beating.
We are dealing with organic chemistry, right?
Yeah.
And environmental physics.
And bacterial ecosystems, all interacting in unpredictable ways. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the textbook lays out 3 incredibly clear, practical reasons why clinicians and investigators must study these post-mortem changes with such rigorous discipline.
I think it's vital we lay those out right now for you listening. First, so that the normal, natural progression of decomposition isn't mistakenly identified as unnatural trauma.
That is a huge one.
Second, so that subtle signs of an unnatural death aren't accidentally missed or just written off as a natural part of the decay process.
Right, missing a subtle injury because you think it's just rot.
Yeah. And third, to make the most accurate, scientifically sound estimation of the time since death.
Those 3 pillars form the absolute foundation of everything we will explore today. A crucial theme that must be maintained throughout this discussion is that postmortem signs are guides. They are not absolute clocks.
Guides, not clocks. I like that.
It's vital. Whenever practitioners, whether they are medical or legal professionals, attempt to overinterpret these biological signs.
When trying to pin it down to the exact minute.
Right. Assigning a level of mathematical precision to them that biology simply does not support, it leads to catastrophic investigative failures and profound miscarriages of justice. The work demands absolute scientific humility from the very first observation.
I think that concept of scientific humility is the perfect lens through which to view the immediate aftermath of death.
It really is the only way to approach it.
Let's explore the rapid changes and what the text calls primary slicidity. This is what occurs the moment irreversible cardiac arrest happens.
The precise moment.
So the heart stops pumping, respiration ceases. From a physiological standpoint, what is the immediate domino effect inside the body?
Well, the very moment the heart stops, there is an immediate catastrophic fall in blood pressure. The immense driving force of the circulatory system just vanishes.
It's just gone.
Gone. Consequently, the supply of freshly oxygenated blood to the billions of cells throughout the body halts completely.
But the cells don't all die at that exact second.
Oh, they don't. Now, the cells themselves do not all die in that exact microscopic instant. It is more of a cascading failure.
Like a power grid going down piece by piece.
That's a great way to visualize it. Initially, the cells that are capable of utilizing anoxic pathways, meaning they can metabolize and generate a tiny amount of energy without oxygen, will switch over and attempt to survive.
They kick into survival mode.
Exactly. They will struggle on, consuming whatever internal metabolic reserves they have left. Only when those reserves are entirely exhausted does their cellular metabolism fail permanently.
So as those individual metabolic fires start going out, we start to see the nervous system shut down.
Yes, and that presents very specific clinical signs.
Without neuronal activity, all nervous function ceases, meaning the physical reflexes that define a living, responsive human being are lost.
Completely lost.
For example, the corneal reflex stops. In a living person, if you touch the surface of the eye, the immediate involuntary reaction is to blink.
You can't help it.
Right. But after cardiac arrest, that vanishes entirely. The pupils also cease their reaction to light. They become fixed, neither dilating nor constricting when a light is shown into them.
Moving beyond the surface reflexes, examining the deeper structures of the eye provides a fascinating direct window into the cessation of circulation.
This is one of those clinical details that really sticks with you.
It really does. If a clinician were to examine the retina at the back of the eye with an ophthalmoscope shortly after death, they would observe a very distinct vascular phenomenon.
Because the blood isn't moving normally anymore.
Right. In a living person, the blood flows through the tiny retinal vessels in a continuous, smooth stream. But without the driving pressure of the heart, that continuous stream breaks up.
It actually separates.
Yes. You observe the physical fragmentation of the columns of blood within the retinal vessels. The text notes that this phenomenon is memorably referred to in forensic pathology as trucking or shunting.
Trucking. That is a very evocative term.
It paints a very clear picture.
It does. It paints a picture of the blood separating into individual segments, almost looking like a line of individual boxcars or railway carriages sitting idle on a track.
Exactly. Simply because there is no pressure pushing them forward anymore.
Alongside that vascular change, the physical structure of the eye alters. The intraocular tension, the fluid pressure that keeps a living eyeball firm and spherical, begins to drop significantly.
The eyes physically become softer to the touch.
Shifting focus from the nervous system and the sensory organs, the muscular and integumentary changes are profound and immediate.
Very much so. Following death, the body enters a state defined as primary flaccidity.
Which means total relaxation.
Yes. This is characterized by a complete, unresisting loss of muscle tone across the entire skeletal system. The muscles go completely slack.
So if you picked up an arm?
If you were to lift the arm of an individual in this state and let it go, it would fall heavily, without any of the natural resistance or resting tone present in living muscle tissue.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the textbook notes a fascinating caveat here, something that feels almost counterintuitive to that total relaxation.
It does confuse a lot of people who witness it.
Even though the body has entered this state of complete flaccidity, the muscles themselves might retain their biological reactivity for a period of hours.
Yes, they do.
They might still respond to a physical tap or an applied chemical stimulus, even though the person is irreversibly dead.
The underlying physiology explains what is often described as the dying motor neurons phenomenon.
Dying motor neurons.
Right. Even after the central brain has ceased to function, the individual motor neurons spread throughout the body are undergoing their final chaotic depolarizations as their cellular energy finally runs out.
They're misfiring as they die.
Exactly. As these individual neurons die, they can spontaneously discharge electrical signals. These erratic signals stimulate small, localized groups of muscle fibers, leading to visible focal muscle twitching.
That has to be so startling to see.
To an untrained observer, seeing a muscle twitch in a deceased individual can be incredibly disturbing. It is frequently misinterpreted as a sign of lingering life.
When really it's just the opposite.
Clinically, it is merely a localized cellular event marking the nervous system's final decay.
Alongside that muscular relaxation, we see immediate changes to the skin. The drastic fall in blood pressure drains the color from the skin, the conjunctivae of the eyes and the mucous membranes rendering them extremely pale.
Mostly pale, yes.
Of course, the text notes exceptions, such as in cases of severe congestive heart failure or certain hypoxic deaths, where the face and lips might retain a deeply engorged red or blue color.
Which can be a very helpful clue.
Absolutely. But speaking of the skin and its appendages, we should address one of the most persistent widespread myths regarding the immediate post-mortem period.
Oh, I know exactly which one you mean.
It's the classic trope that hair and nails continue to grow for days after a person dies.
It is a complete biological impossibility for hair or nails to grow without a functioning circulatory system to provide the necessary nutrients and cellular energy.
Because growth requires energy.
Always. The hair follicles and the nail matrix die at the exact same time as the rest of the integumentary system.
So why do people believe it so strongly?
The reason this myth is so deeply entrenched in popular culture, and the reason it visually appears that growth has occurred to people viewing a body days later, is purely an optical illusion driven by dehydration.
The body's drying out.
Precisely. As the body loses moisture to the surrounding environment, the soft tissues of the skin begin to retract and shrink back.
Ah, so it's pulling away.
When the skin specifically around the nail beds and the base of the hair follicles shrinks, it exposes a greater length of the nail and more of the underlying hair shaft.
So they aren't getting longer.
They appear longer and more prominent simply because the tissue hiding their bases has receded. It is post-mortem skin retraction, not post-mortem cellular growth.
That distinction highlights why clinical observation must be separated from common assumption.
It's a critical separation.
Let's look at another area that requires immense medico-legal documentation discipline, driven directly by that state of primary flaccidity. Because of the total loss of muscle tone, investigators frequently encounter the voiding of urine, the passing of feces, or the post-mortem leakage of semen from the penile urethra.
Because the sphincter muscles let go.
Right. The sphincter muscles, which require energy to remain contracted and continent, have simply relaxed entirely.
The clinical discipline required here must be ironclad, because the misinterpretation of these specific signs has historically caused significant issues in death investigations. How so? Well, in poorly trained investigative circles, or in older, less rigorous literature, these findings are sometimes touted as pathognomonic.
Meaning uniquely diagnostic.
Right, diagnostic of highly specific, violent, or distressing deaths. For instance, the voiding of the bladder is sometimes incorrectly assumed to be a definitive sign of death by extreme terror, mechanical asphyxia, or a fatal epileptic seizure.
But the textbook explicitly warns against drawing those straight lines.
It strongly warns against it.
The biology just doesn't support it.
No. The voiding of the bladder or the bowels can be present in almost any cause of death, from a sudden cardiac arrest in bed to a traumatic injury, purely as a function of generalized muscle relaxation.
It's just gravity and relaxation.
It is a completely nonspecific finding. Furthermore, the post-mortem leakage of semen cannot, under any circumstances, be utilized as a standalone indicator that sexual activity occurred immediately prior to death.
That is a very important point for investigators.
It represents the passive release of fluid from the seminal vesicles due to the relaxation of the surrounding smooth muscle, often aided by gravity, or the onset of rigor mortis later squeezing the vesicles.
So it's mechanical.
Exactly. Suggesting in a legal setting that post-mortem semen leakage proves paramortem sexual assault without robust corroborating physical evidence is a profound and dangerous error.
Another incredibly common finding that creates massive confusion at a death scene, or during an autopsy, is the presence of gastric contents, partially digested food or fluid in the mouth, the throat, or the deep airways.
We see this all the time.
The text points out that regurgitation of stomach contents is a remarkably common feature of terminal collapse. The body is shutting down, the esophageal sphincters relax, and the fluid simply moves passively upward.
And we also see it constantly after someone has undergone CPR.
Cardiopulmonary resuscitation, because the chest compressions.
Right, the intense rhythmic chest compressions literally force the stomach contents upward into the pharynx.
This specific scenario forces a critical differential diagnosis in forensic pathology.
A very tricky one.
A pathologist will identify gastric contents in the airways in a very significant proportion of all standard autopsies. However, the mere presence of this material in the trachea or the bronchi cannot automatically be labeled as aspiration.
Aspiration has a very specific medical meaning.
Right. In medical terms, aspiration implies that the individual actively inhaled or choked on their vomit while they were still alive, and that this obstruction or the resulting chemical pneumonitis was the actual cause of death.
Whereas regurgitation is merely the passive post-mortem movement of fluid.
So, if a pathologist opens the airway and sees food debris, how do they scientifically distinguish between someone who actively choked to death and someone who died of heart attack and then passively regurgitated?
Because the gross anatomy looks identical to the naked eye.
Exactly. So what do?
To definitively state that gastric aspiration was the underlying cause of death, the pathologist cannot rely solely on the macroscopic visual examination. They must secure microscopic proof.
They have to look at the cellular level.
They take tissue samples from the deep peripheral airways of the lungs and examine them under a microscope. They are looking not just for microscopic food debris deep in the bronchioles, but crucially, they are looking for an accompanying inflammatory response in the surrounding lung tissue.
Because dead tissue doesn't get inflamed.
Exactly. If the tissue shows an active infiltration of white blood cells and signs of acute inflammation, it proves that the lung tissue was alive and actively reacting to the foreign material when it entered.
The person breathed it in while living.
Yes. Without that vital microscopic evidence of inflammation or a highly reliable eyewitness account of a choking event, labeling aspiration as the cause of death is medically indefensible.
Building that conceptual framework. Understanding the mechanism, observing the injury, interpreting it correctly, and understanding the legal implication is exactly what this deep dive is about for you.
It's the core of the practice.
Let's transition into the next major phase of postmortem change. We are moving from the profound relaxation of primary flaccidity into the profound stiffness of rigor mortis.
Rigor mortis is a concept universally recognized in popular culture, usually depicted simply as a body getting stiff.
Like a board.
Right. However, its actual biochemical reality is rarely understood with clinical accuracy. Simpson's forensic medicine defines rigor mortis not just as stiffness, but as a highly specific temperature-dependent physicochemical change.
It's not magic, it's chemistry.
It is a complex chemical equation occurring entirely within the microscopic structure of the muscle cells, driven directly by the sudden lack of oxygen.
Let's break down that precise biochemical mechanism, because this is a classic exam topic and absolutely fundamental to understanding forensic physiology.
It comes up constantly.
When a human body is alive and functioning normally, it utilizes oxygen to create energy through a process called oxidative phosphorylation.
And the end product of that process is a molecule called ATP.
Adenosine triphosphate.
Yes, which serves as the primary energy currency for every cell in the body.
Once irreversible cardiac arrest occurs, the supply of oxygenated blood is abruptly cut off. The process of oxidative phosphorylation grinds to an immediate halt.
The factory loses power.
But the muscle cell, desperate to maintain its internal equilibrium, switches to its secondary, backup system, anoxic respiration.
It tries to keep going without oxygen.
Right. This pathway allows the cell to produce a very small amount of ATP without requiring oxygen, but it comes at a steep physiological cost.
Because of the byproduct.
Exactly. The major byproduct of anoxic respiration is lactic acid, which begins to rapidly accumulate within the closed system of the cell.
We end up with two critical events happening simultaneously inside the muscle cell. The cellular battery is dying, meaning ATP levels are dropping drastically, and the internal environment is becoming incredibly toxic and highly acidic due to the massive buildup of lactic acid.
So how does that translate into a muscle becoming physically rigid?
The physical change is triggered by that exact combination of low ATP and high intracellular acidity. Inside our skeletal muscles are two primary protein filaments responsible for contraction, known as actin and myosin.
Sliding filaments.
Yes. In a living, energy-rich muscle, these filaments slide past each other to create a muscular contraction, and critically, they require a constant supply of ATP to release from one another and allow the muscle to relax.
They need energy to let go.
Precisely. But in the dead, highly acidic, energy-depleted environment of a post-mortem muscle cell, the actin and myosin fibers irrevocably bind together. Because there is no new ATP being generated to facilitate their release, they lock into place.
You just get stuck.
They form a rigid, immovable gel at the microscopic level. The macroscopic result of billions of these microscopic fibers locking together is the overall stiffening of the entire muscle group.
A key learning anchor the textbook emphasizes is the distinction between a muscle locking and a muscle contracting.
This is a huge misconception.
Even though the muscles become incredibly stiff and rigid, they do not actually shorten or contract during the onset of rigor mortis.
That distinction is vital. Rigor mortis is a freezing in place, a locking of the current position, not an active contraction pulling the limbs inward.
So it doesn't pull your arms up to your chest on its own?
No. The only exception to this rule is if the muscle was already under significant physical tension at the exact moment the chemical locking process began. Otherwise, the muscle simply solidifies at whatever length it was resting at during the phase of primary flaccidity.
Because rigor mortis is essentially a massive body-wide chemical equation, it is highly sensitive to external and internal variables.
Very sensitive.
Let's map out the general timeline of rigor and then look at the factors that can totally skew that timeline.
The entire process relies on the depletion of cellular energy reserves. Therefore, any physiological state that massively depletes a person's energy reserves before they die will drastically accelerate the chemical onset of rigor.
So if you burn through your ATP while you're alive,
it happens much faster when you're dead. If an individual has very low muscle glycogen levels, or if their muscles are already highly acidic at the moment of death, for example, if they were engaged in extreme, frantic physical exercise, running for their life, or struggling violently just before dying, the lactic acid is already present.
the stage is already set.
The ATP is already depleted. In these cases, rigor will develop much, much faster.
The textbook also specifically highlights death by electrocution as a cause of extraordinarily rapid rigor onset.
Yes, likely due to the massive, repeated, and violent electrical stimulation of the muscles depleting the cellular ATP almost instantaneously.
That makes total sense.
Similarly, a death occurring during status epilepticus, a prolonged, continuous seizure, will result in incredibly fast stiffening due to profound muscular exhaustion.
On the flip side of that equation, there are factors that can heavily mask the presence of rigor, making it incredibly difficult for a clinician to detect, even when the underlying chemistry is actively happening.
The sheer volume of skeletal muscle mass plays a significant role in detection.
So if someone doesn't have a lot of muscle,
Right. In the very young, such as infants, or the very old, or individuals who are severely emaciated due to chronic illness, the overall muscle bulk is so low that even when the actin and myosin fibers bind together, the resulting physical stiffness is exceptionally weak.
so the chemistry is happening.
The chemistry of rigor is occurring exactly as it should, but the physical manifestation is so slight that it is difficult to palpate or assess clinically.
Let's outline the standard temporal progression, assuming a perfectly average adult body in average temperate environmental conditions. How does rigor typically manifest over time?
In idealized temperate conditions, the chemical process of rigor actually develops uniformly throughout all the muscle cells of the body at roughly the same rate.
But we don't feel it everywhere all at once.
No. We can physically detect it first in the smallest muscle groups, simply because it takes fewer locked fibers to immobilize a small joint than a large one.
That's logical.
Therefore, a clinician will typically feel the stiffness first in the small muscles of the face, around the eyes, the mouth, and particularly the jaw, usually becoming detectable between 1 and 4 hours after death.
And from that initial presentation in the face, it gives the clinical impression of marching downwards to the rest of the body.
It creates a visual illusion of advancing downwards. After the face and jaw, the stiffness becomes detectable in the progressively larger muscle groups, moving to the neck, the arms, the trunk, and finally the heavy muscles of the legs.
What's the time frame for that spread?
This widespread involvement is typically noted between 3 and 6 hours after death. The rigidity continues to build in chemical intensity, reaching its maximum physical strength at approximately 18 hours post-mortem.
Though this peak can vary wildly.
It varies tremendously based on temperature and exertion.
But the body doesn't remain rigid forever. Eventually, the stiffness resolves, and the body returns to a soft state. Why does the rigor break?
Rigor mortis remains fully established for roughly 2 days, again heavily dependent on ambient temperature. It does not resolve because the actin and myosin miraculously unbind or relax.
They don't just let go.
They can't. It resolves because the next major phase of biological death takes over: autolysis and decomposition.
The tissue is actually breaking down.
The physical structures of the muscle cells themselves, including the locked actin and myosin filaments, begin to literally decompose and disintegrate. The chemical bonds are destroyed by enzymes, and the muscles subsequently return to a state known as secondary flaccidity.
The textbook is very specific about the clinical technique required to actually test for rigor mortis during an examination. A medical student can't just walk up to a body, grab an arm, and aggressively yank on it to see if it's stiff.
Aggressive manipulation is entirely contraindicated. Testing for rigor requires a gentle, deliberate, and cautious approach.
How much pressure are we talking about?
A clinician should test the resistance across a joint, such as an elbow, a wrist, or a knee, using very gentle pressure, applied with only 1 or 2 fingers.
Just 2 fingers.
The sole clinical objective is to feel the presence and assess the extent of the stiffness to gauge the resistance the muscle offers. The objective is never to apply enough force to break the rigor.
Because if a clinician applies too much mechanical force and physically tears those locked actin and myosin bonds apart, they ruin the clinical sign entirely.
If you mechanically break the rigor by forcing a stiff joint to bend, you have irreversibly destroyed the chemical bonds in those specific muscle groups.
You can't put them back together.
They cannot be reliably tested again to assess their natural state of rigor progression. The text does note a fascinating, nuanced caveat to this rule, though.
Yeah.
If rigor is mechanically broken very early in its developmental phase, when only a fraction of the fibers have locked, it actually can reestablish itself.
Because the rest of the fibers are still locking.
Exactly. The remaining unlocked fibers will continue their chemical process, and the joint may stiffen again, sometimes becoming even more rigid than before the initial manipulation.
But standard practice is still to be gentle.
the standard practice remains. Document precisely what resistance you felt with a gentle touch, and ensure you do not aggressively manipulate the body before the entire forensic assessment is complete.
Discussing the rapid onset of rigor raises an important question regarding a highly specific, historically debated phenomenon.
The instantaneous rigor debate.
Right. The outline demands we address the concept, or perhaps the myth, of instantaneous rigor.
This refers to cadaveric rigidity, known in historical medical literature as instantaneous rigor, or by the French term spasme cadavérique.
The core idea here is incredibly dramatic. It suggests that rigor mortis can set in at the exact split-second, millisecond of death, freezing the body instantly.
Like a statue.
Historically, the literature almost always attributed this to individuals who died while under intense, overwhelming emotional terror or extreme physical stress. The classic textbook examples are soldiers on a battlefield found gripping their rifles so tightly their fingers have to be pried off, suicides found with their finger rigidly locked onto the trigger of the handgun. Or, as Simpson's figure 5.1 illustrates, victims recovered from drowning who have clumps of river weeds or grass clutched fiercely in their dead hands.
The concept of the final, terrifying emotional state being frozen permanently in physical form is narratively compelling. It makes for great fiction.
But medically,
Modern forensic science views spasme cadavérique with profound skepticism. Critical scrutiny of these historical accounts, combined with a better understanding of post-mortem physics, suggests a much more mundane mechanical explanation for these frozen grips.
it's not a magical, instantaneous freezing of the muscle chemistry. It's largely considered an artifact of environmental positioning combined with the normal, albeit rapid, onset of rigor.
Consider the drowning victim found clutching the weeds. As the person is drowning, in a state of sheer panic and oxygen starvation, they grab a handful of weeds in a final, frantic, living grasp.
They're fighting for their life.
They die. Their body immediately enters the state of primary flaccidity.
So they should let go.
But they don't always.
Okay.
Because the physical constraints of their environment, the weeds tangled in their fingers, the pressure of the water current pushing against their closed hand, or perhaps the way their hand is wedged against the riverbank, prevents the hand from passively springing open.
Gravity or water pressure holds the fingers closed around the object.
Then, because the victim died in a state of extreme physical exertion and oxygen depletion, the normal onset of rigor mortis begins incredibly rapidly.
Because their ATP was already gone.
Exactly. It chemically locks the hand in that closed position. When the body is eventually recovered hours later, it appears as though the living grip never relaxed.
Leading an observer to the false conclusion of instantaneous rigor.
It is a vital forensic reminder not to leap to sensational conclusions when basic physics, environmental constraints, and normal post-mortem physiology provide a sound scientific answer.
That concept of environmental physics bridging with biology leads us perfectly into the next major post-mortem change. Livor mortis.
Also known as post-mortem hypostasis.
We are shifting our focus from the complex chemistry of the muscles to the simple, undeniable gravity acting upon the blood.
When we discuss hypostasis or lividity, we are discussing pure passive physics.
It's just fluids and gravity.
In a living body, the heart generates immense pressure to force blood through the vast network of arteries, capillaries, and veins, fighting against gravity to perfuse the brain and upper body.
When the heart stops, that driving pressure drops to zero immediately.
Simultaneously, the muscular tone of the entire vascular bed relaxes, and the blood vessels passively dilate. At that point, the billions of red blood cells suspended in the plasma are subject entirely to the downward force of gravity.
They just sink?
They passively sink, filtering through the relaxed vascular network and settle into the blood vessels located in the lowest dependent areas of the body.
And it is this massive, microscopic pooling of red blood cells beneath the skin that creates the visual manifestation we call livor mortis.
That distinct pink, purplish, or bluish discoloration of the skin.
Let's establish the standard timeline for when this becomes visible to investigator.
This internal settling process begins almost instantaneously after circulation ceases. However, the visual discoloration on the skin surface is generally considered to develop and become noticeable to the naked eye within the first 30 minutes to 2 hours after death.
And it gets darker over time.
The pooling continues to deepen in color as more red cells settle, becoming highly obvious and fully developed up to about 12 hours post-mortem.
But just like rigor mortis, the presence of liver is not an absolute universal guarantee.
No, it's not.
There are significant physiological conditions where a pathologist might not see it at all, or where the visual signs are completely masked.
We must always contextualize the post-mortem signs with the physiological state of the body at the exact time of death.
So if they lost a lot of blood,
If an individual died from severe exsanguinating hemorrhage, meaning they bled to death, there simply are not enough red blood cells remaining in the vascular system to pool and create visible lividity.
the body will just appear profoundly pale overall.
Similarly, in the very young, the very old, or individuals suffering from profound clinical anemia before death, hypostasis may be exceedingly faint or completely absent.
And skin tone plays a big role in identifying it.
Absolutely. Purely from a visual diagnostic standpoint, a perfectly normal development of lividity can be heavily masked by the individual's natural darker skin tones, or by competing systemic color changes, such as profound jaundice turning the skin deep yellow, which obscures the purple pooling.
When lividity is visible, pattern recognition becomes the paramount forensic skill. The specific distribution of this pooled blood tells investigators a highly detailed story about the body's positioning in the hours following death.
The site and distribution of hypostasis must always be interpreted in strict relation to gravity.
So if they're on their back,
If a body is lying supine, perfectly flat on its back on a floor, the lividity will be distributed across the entire posterior aspect, the back of the neck, the shoulders, the lower back, the buttocks, and the back of the legs.
and if they are hanging,
If we consider a totally different spatial orientation, such as a victim of a hanging, the pattern is radically different. A body suspended vertically by a ligature around the neck will develop deep, intense hypostasis in the lower legs, the feet, the forearms, and the hands, precisely because those are the lowest dependent points pulling the blood downwards.
you'd see none on their chest.
You will likely see absolutely no lividity on the upper chest or the back.
But even within those lowest dependent areas where the blood pools, the discoloration isn't a solid, uniform block of purple. There is a crucial differentiation anchor we need to discuss, a phenomenon known as contact pallor.
Contact pallor is an essential diagnostic feature that provides immense contextual detail. Hypostasis only occurs in areas where the superficial blood vessels, the capillary beds just under the skin, are open and capable of being distended by the pooling blood.
What if they're pressed against something?
If the skin is compressed against any firm surface, that physical pressure collapses the tiny capillary beds. The blood cannot physically enter those compressed vessels, regardless of gravity.
So imagine a body lying flat on its back on a hard floor. Gravity pulls the blood to the back, but the prominent bony areas bearing the actual weight of the body.
The shoulder blades, the buttocks, the back of the calves.
Right. Those are pressed hard against the floor. Those specific areas of skin will appear stark white, while the surrounding uncompressed skin of the back will be a deep, dark purple.
Precisely. You will see areas of relative or complete pallor starkly contrasting within the overall hypostasis. And it's not just the weight of the body against the floor that causes this.
Our clothing can do it too.
Tight clothing, a cinched belt, the elastic band of underwear, a tight bra strap, or even deep creases in a thick blanket underneath the body can create distinct, recognizable linear marks of contact pallor.
Which is like a ghost imprint of what they were wearing.
These marks can sometimes help identify what the person was wearing or lying on when they died, even if the body is found naked later.
This concept of contact pallor brings us to perhaps the most dangerous diagnostic trap in early forensic assessment.
It trips up inexperienced investigators constantly.
What happens to the lividity pattern when a body is lying completely face down in a prone position?
When a body lies face down for hours, gravity pulls the massive volume of blood in the head directly into the relatively lax, loose, soft tissues of the face.
Which causes incredible swelling.
This creates incredibly intense, dark vascular congestion, making the face look swollen and deeply bruised. Because the delicate capillary beds in the face, particularly around the eyes, cannot withstand this massive, sustained hydrostatic pressure, they often rupture.
Creating those tiny red dots.
Yes, this rupture results in petechial hemorrhages, tiny pinpoint spots of dark red bleeding scattered across the skin of the face and within the conjunctivae, the whites of the eyes.
Now, add contact pallor to that scenario. If their face is pressed heavily into a pillow or a firm mattress, the prominent features bearing the weight, the tip of the nose, the lips, the chin, will be compressed.
The blood is squeezed out.
Creating stark white patches of contact pallor right around the airway.
And therein lies the immense diagnostic trap. You have a body with intense purple facial congestion, you observe petechial hemorrhages in the eyes, and you see distinct white rings of pallor surrounding the nose and mouth.
To an untrained eye.
Or a rushed investigator arriving at a chaotic scene, this visual presentation mimics almost exactly the classic signs of mechanical asphyxiation.
It looks like suffocation.
It looks precisely like suffocation, as if someone forcefully pressed a pillow over the victim's face, causing the pallor around the mouth, and violently strangled them, causing the intense congestion and metechia.
So how does a forensic pathologist differentiate between the simple, passive effects of gravity on a prone body and a brutal murder by suffocation? Because they look identical from the outside.
They cannot make that differentiation simply by observing the surface of the body. In these specific high-state circumstances, the pathologist must proceed with extreme caution and clinical rigor during the autopsy.
They have to look deeper.
They must attempt to scientifically exclude actual inflicted pressure to the mouth, nose, and neck. To do this, they perform an incredibly careful, meticulous, layer-by-layer dissection of the anterior neck structures.
And timing matters here, right?
But critically, they must perform this neck dissection only after they have removed the brain and the heart from the body.
Why is that?
Removing those organs allows the excess blood pooled in the head and neck to drain away naturally. This significantly reduces the artifactual bleeding that occurs when you cut into congested tissue.
So you don't mistake your own autopsy cuts for bruising.
Exactly. Once drained, they dissect the neck looking for deep internal bruising in the strap muscles, microscopic tears, or fractured hyoid bones and thyroid cartilage that would definitively prove perimortem trauma.
Surface appearance alone in a prone body is never, ever sufficient to diagnose asphyxia.
Never.
Let's unpack the color of the lividity itself. We've established it's usually pink, purple, or blue due to deoxygenated blood, but severe toxicological factors can dramatically alter that color profile.
Which provides immediate visual clues to the pathologist.
The standard color of hypostasis is a function of the deoxygenated state of the hemoglobin. However, certain potent chemical compounds bind directly to the hemoglobin molecule, fundamentally changing its pigment.
And consequently, the color of the pooled blood visible through the skin.
The absolute classic board exam question regarding lividity color: deep cherry pink lividity.
A vibrant cherry pink lividity is the visual hallmark of fatal carbon monoxide poisoning.
HEO poisoning.
The carbon monoxide gas binds with the hemoglobin in the blood with far greater affinity than oxygen does, forming a highly stable compound called carboxyhemoglobin, which is exceptionally bright pink.
So a fire victim.
A body recovered from a house fire or a closed garage with a running car will often display this unmistakable color.
What toxicological profile is suggested by a dark red or a distinct brick red color in the hypostasis?
A dark brick red lividity is strongly associated with acute cyanide poisoning.
How does cyanide do that?
Cyanide works by interfering with the cell's ability to utilize oxygen at a microscopic level. Because the cells cannot absorb the oxygen from the blood, the venous blood remains highly oxygenated, retaining a bright, deep red color as it pools.
And there's a bronze color too, right?
We also occasionally observe a distinct bronze or heavily jaundiced-looking hypostasis. This bronze color is associated with severe, overwhelming septic infections by the bacteria Clostridium perfringens.
Because it destroys the blood cells.
This bacteria produces powerful toxins that rapidly hemolyze or break down the red blood cells, altering the pigment entirely.
But the textbook issues a critical warning here regarding these color profiles. A forensic investigator must never base their entire conclusion on the color of the skin alone.
Never. The text is unambiguous. These post-mortem color changes are highly variable and subjective.
They depend on so many things.
They are heavily influenced by the deceased's original natural skin tone, the specific artificial lighting conditions inside the mortuary or at the scene, and the subjective visual perception of the individual observer.
It's a clue, not a verdict.
They are powerful visual clues that should immediately prompt targeted toxicological testing, but they are never definitive conclusions on their own. They must be integrated with the entire suite of postmortem findings and scene evidence.
Before we move on from lividity, let's briefly touch on what hypostasis can tell an investigator about movement at a crime scene. Lividity can act as a physical record of the body's position over time.
Indeed. Because hypostasis is driven by gravity, its location is fixed relative to the body's position during the hours it forms.
So if it doesn't match the scene,
If investigators find a body lying face down on the floor, but upon examination the intense purple lividity is entirely distributed across their back, it is a scientific certainty that the individual died while lying on their back.
They remained in that position for hours while the blood settled.
And coagulated, yes, and was subsequently rolled over or moved long after death had occurred.
And what if the body is moved earlier while the lividity is still actively developing and the blood hasn't fully coagulated?
Even after blood normally begins to coagulate post-mortem, the red cells maintain some limited ability to move and resettle for a significant period.
So you get two patterns.
Yes. If a body is shifted, for instance, moved from lying on their back to lying on their side several hours after death, you will frequently observe what is known as dual lividity.
Overlapping shadows.
You will find two overlapping patterns. One primary, darker pattern representing the initial position, and a secondary, slightly fainter pattern representing the final position as a portion of the uncoagulated blood slowly redistributes to the new dependent areas.
So we have explored the timelines of rigor mortis and the physics of livor mortis. But when police investigators or medical examiners really want to lock down a time of death, the immediate question is almost always about body temperature.
It's what everyone asks for.
That brings us to Section 4. Algor mortis, the cooling of the body, and the highly controversial estimation of the post-mortem interval.
This specific area of study is perhaps the most heavily contested, most mathematically complex, and frankly, the most misunderstood area of practical forensic pathology.
Because of TV shows.
There is a pervasive assumption, heavily reinforced by television and fiction, that because a dead body slowly cools down to match room temperature, we can simply utilize basic thermodynamics to run the clock backward and pinpoint the exact minute the heart stopped.
People always cite Newton's law of cooling to justify this math.
Newton's law of cooling is a foundational physics principle. It states simply that heat will pass from a warmer object to a cooler surrounding environment, and the temperature of the warmer object will fall at a highly predictable exponential rate.
Which sounds great on paper.
And if a human body were a solid, perfectly uniform sphere of highly conductive metal, Newton's law would work flawlessly.
But we aren't metal spheres.
A human body is wildly, aggressively non-uniform. It is a complex, irregular mass composed of varying densities of fat, dense muscle, hollow bone cavities, and massive amounts of water, all of which insulate against heat loss and conduct thermal energy at vastly different rates.
Plus, the environment isn't a vacuum.
Furthermore, the body sits in real-world environments that are never completely stable or thermally uniform.
Beyond the non-uniform structure of the body, the biology of death defies the simple physics immediately. If we look at the sequence of thermal changes, there is a massive biological plateau right at the beginning of the cooling process.
That initial temperature plateau is the first major stumbling block for simple calculations.
Why does it plateau?
When a person dies, their core temperature, the heat deep within the torso and the brain, often does not fall at all for the first hour, or sometimes even longer.
Because it's insulated.
The core organs are deeply insulated by layers of muscle and fat. As the superficial outer tissues of the skin and limbs cool down first, they actually begin to act as a thermal barrier, trapping the remaining heat inside the deep core for an unpredictable period.
So the outside cools, but the inside stays hot.
Only when that outer layer cools sufficiently does the thermal gradient finally force the core temperature to begin dropping. Because of this unpredictable initial plateau, you cannot simply draw a straight, mathematically predictable line backward to the exact moment of death.
To really dismantle the idea of a perfect time of death calculation, the textbook outlines 3 fundamental, inherently flawed assumptions that an investigator must make if they're going to use temperature to calculate the PMI.
Let's dissect them one by one, because understanding these flaws is crucial to forensic humility.
What's the first assumption?
The first required assumption is that the individual's core body temperature was exactly normal, 37 degrees Celsius, or 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, at the exact split second their heart stopped beating.
Which, in a clinical reality, is almost never true.
It is remarkably rare. We routinely ignore normal diurnal variation. A healthy person's temperature naturally drops to its lowest point in the early hours of the morning and peaks in the late afternoon.
So time of day matters before they even die.
If the person died at 3 a.m., their starting temperature was already lower. We ignore physiological states. Were they running or violently struggling before death? Extreme exercise rapidly raises core temperature.
What if they were sick?
Did they have a fever from an underlying infection? Did they suffer from hypothermia due to environmental exposure prior to cardiac arrest? If your initial starting temperature in the mathematical formula is wrong by even 1 degree, your entire subsequent calculation is immediately and irrevocably invalid.
The second flawed assumption required for the math to work.
The second assumption is a mathematical leap of faith. It assumes that we possess a magical mathematical formula capable of perfectly extrapolating a reliable long-term timeline from a single static post-mortem temperature reading taken hours later.
Knowing everything we just said about the plateau and insulation.
Given the extreme non-uniformity of the human body's composition and the unpredictable duration of that initial temperature plateau we discussed, any formula is, at best, a highly educated approximation. It is never a mathematical certainty.
And the third assumption relies on the environment.
Yes. The calculation demands the assumption that the body has lain undisturbed in a thermally static, completely unchanging environment from the moment of death until the moment the investigator takes the temperature reading.
But the real world, outside of a temperature-controlled mortuary refrigerator, isn't a static laboratory.
Far from it. Even a body found lying on a rug in a typical mundane living room is subjected to immense invisible thermal fluctuations.
The AC kicks on.
The central heating system cycles on and off on a preset timer. A window might be left open, creating a draft.
Sunlight coming through a window.
The sun moves across the sky over several hours, shining intensely through a pane of glass directly onto the torso of the body, actively warming it before moving into shadow.
And outside is even worse.
If the body is discovered outdoors, the chaotic variations of wind speed, sudden rain, cloud cover, and shifting humidity make calculating a sensible, usable, average environmental temperature over a 12-hour period practically impossible.
So what does this all mean?
Yeah.
Despite all these massive caveats, these immense biological and environmental hurdles, forensic science still requires standardized tools to attempt this estimation when demanded by an investigation.
We have to try.
And the premier tool highlighted in modern texts is Henste's nomogram.
Henste's nomogram is currently the most widely recognized, extensively researched, and legally accepted method for temperature-based PMI estimation.
But as an estimate.
However, it must be understood as a complex tool of estimation, not an instrument of precision. It is essentially a highly complicated graphical calculator. To utilize it effectively, a pathologist or trained scene investigator must input 3 primary, highly accurate variables.
The first variable is the core body temperature of the deceased.
Yes. Historically, obtaining a true core temperature required inserting a long chemical thermometer deep into the rectum,
Which is invasive.
Today, robust electronic probes are more common. These might utilize the deep nasal passages or the ear canal, but the pathologist must be acutely aware that these superficial orifices will cool faster and react differently to ambient air than the deep mass of the liver or the rectum, thereby altering the raw data.
And there's an evidentiary risk at the scene, too.
Furthermore, from a crime scene management perspective, inserting a rigid probe into the rectum has the potential to destroy vital trace forensic evidence, such as sebum, DNA, or microscopic trauma in a suspected sexual assault case.
So you can't just jump in and do it.
Therefore, obtaining this reading requires extreme coordination and communication between the medical examiner and the lead investigators before the body is manipulated.
The second primary variable required for the nomogram is the ambient environmental temperature.
This reading is incredibly time-sensitive. The very first police officers or crime scene examiners must record the ambient air temperature immediately upon arriving at the scene.
Right next to the body.
The thermometer should be placed adjacent to the body, at the same height. This must be done before they begin opening doors to the outside, before they turn on massive heat-generating forensic lighting rigs.
And before the room fills with people.
Crucially, before they flood a small room with the body heat of half a dozen breathing investigators, all of which will artificially raise the ambient temperature reading and skew the calculation.
And the third fundamental variable is the body weight of the deceased.
Correct. The overall mass dictates the thermal momentum.
But once you have those 3 precise numbers, and you plot them on the physical nomogram by drawing straight lines connecting the core temperature point to the ambient temperature point, extending that line to intersect the body weight scale, you still aren't finished.
You must then apply empirical corrective factors to the calculated body weight.
Because basic physics dictates that 90 kilograms of a completely naked body will cool at a vastly different rate than 90 kilograms of a person wearing a thick wool sweater and a winter coat.
Exactly. The nomogram provides a standardized table of these corrective factors. A naked body lying in still air is assigned a baseline factor of 1.0.
And clothing changes that factor.
But if the body is dressed in 2 or more thicker layers of clothing, the corrective factor increases above 1.0. This mathematical adjustment simulates a heavier, more insulated body that will naturally cool much slower.
What if it's wet?
Conversely, if the clothing is soaked wet, or if the body is submerged in flowing water, the factor drops significantly below 1.0, representing a state of aggressively accelerated heat loss.
Let's get down to the harsh legal reality of utilizing Hensuge's nomogram in a criminal investigation, because this is where the demand for scientific humility truly crystallizes. Let's imagine a perfect scenario. You have the perfect, indisputable core temperature reading. You have an accurate, undisturbed ambient reading. You know the exact weight of the victim, and you have flawlessly applied to the correct clothing factors.
The ideal scenario.
What is the actual stated accuracy of this premier tool?
The creator of the tool, Professor Klaus Henst himself, claims only a 95% statistical accuracy rate under those ideal conditions. And crucially, that 95% accuracy is not a specific time. It is expressed as a wide confidence interval, a window of plus or minus 2.8 hours around the final calculated time.
Plus or minus 2.8 hours. That creates a total spread, a window of uncertainty of 5.6 hours.
Think about the profound implications of that 5.6-hour window in a court of law during a murder trial.
It's massive.
If a prime suspect testifies that they were sitting in a crowded diner surrounded by witnesses from 8:000 p.m. until 10:00 p.m., and the forensic expert uses the nomogram to suggest the calculated time of death was 9:00 p.m.
But the scientific reality of the 95% confidence interval means the death actually could have occurred anywhere between roughly 6.15 p.m. and 11.45 p.m. The suspect's rock-solid alibi falls entirely comfortably within the forensic margin of error. The science cannot disprove their alibi.
Which is precisely why regulatory bodies like the UK Forensic Science Regulator have issued such explicit restrictive guidelines on presenting this data. Their directives are unambiguous and legally binding for practitioners. The forensic pathologist must explicitly, clearly communicate to the lead investigator and ultimately to the judge and jury in court that the precise accuracy of the temperature estimate cannot be definitively determined.
You can't give a specific time.
And critically, they mandate that temperature cooling methods should never, under any circumstances, be utilized to define a narrow, precise, chronological period in which a death occurred. It is a broad, contextual clue, nothing more.
And the textbook adds a fantastic final blunt note on the topic of Algor mortis. Historical rules of thumb, such as the old adage, the body loses 1 degree of temperature per hour, or the scenario of a police officer simply touching a body with their bare hand and dramatically declaring it feels cold so they've been dead a while, are scientifically useless, wildly inaccurate, and have absolutely no place in modern forensic practice.
None whatsoever. They are dangerous guesswork masquerading as investigative science.
Having established the limitations of the early physical changes, let's move forward into Section 5, Decomposition. We are transitioning away from the immediate post-mortem period and entering the phase where the body undergoes a profound structural metamorphosis through the dual processes of autolysis and putrefaction.
This is the phase where the biological breakdown truly accelerates and visually alters the body beyond recognition. We must distinguish clinically between these two fundamental concurrent processes.
Let's start with autolysis.
Autolysis is a sterile, entirely chemical process. It is quite literally cellular self-digestion. Inside almost every living cell are organelles called lysosomes.
Like little stomach pouches in the cells.
Think of them as tiny sealed packets of highly potent digestive enzymes. When the cell dies and its internal membranes begin to degrade from a lack of energy, these lysosomes burst open.
Releasing the acid.
They release their acidic enzymes into the cell, which begin to digest and break down the body's own tissues from the inside out, completely independent of any bacterial action.
But autolysis alone, while softening the organs, doesn't cause the drastic, colorful visual changes and the massive tissue destruction we associate with a decaying body. That heavy lifting is the job of putrefaction.
Putrefaction is the microbial takeover. While autolysis is a sterile chemical process, putrefaction is a biological process driven entirely by microorganisms.
And they don't come from the dirt.
And what is most fascinating, and perhaps a bit macabre from a philosophical standpoint, is that we generally do not catch these bacteria from the dirt or the surrounding environment. We carry the architects of our own destruction inside us every day.
We are talking about the human microbiome.
Exactly. The trillions of commensal bacteria that live safely and symbiotically within our intestines during life, aiding in the digestion of our food, are constantly held in check by our active, living immune system and the physical cellular barrier of the bowel wall.
But when we die,
When we die, that immune system stalls instantly. Simultaneously, the physical barriers of the intestines begin to break down and soften through the sterile process of autolysis.
the cage is open.
Those billions of gut bacteria suddenly find themselves in an incredibly nutrient-rich, warm, dark environment with absolutely no biological defenses remaining. They easily breach the softening bowel wall, escape into the abdominal cavity, and begin to ravenously consume the body.
The textbook relies heavily on pattern recognition to track this process. In a temperate, average climate, what is the very first external visual sign of this putrefactive bacterial invasion?
The first externally visible sign of putrefaction typically manifests around days 3 or 4 in a standard temperate environment. It presents as a very distinct localized patch of green discoloration.
And it's always in the same spot.
And crucially, it almost always appears in a highly specific anatomical location, the right iliac fossa, which is the lower right quadrant of the anterior abdominal wall.
From a physiological standpoint, why does it start there? Why not the chest or the left side of the abdomen?
It is a matter of pure internal anatomy. The cecum, which is a large pouch forming the very first part of the large intestine, is absolutely teeming with one of the highest concentrations of bacteria in the human body.
And where does it sit?
Anatomically, the cecum lies extremely close to the superficial abdominal wall in that specific lower right quadrant. As the bacteria rapidly breach the cecum, they have a very short distance to travel before they infiltrate the surrounding skin, fat, and muscle tissues of the right iliac fossa.
And what makes it turn green?
There, as a byproduct of their metabolism, they begin to decompose the hemoglobin in the pooled blood. This specific chemical breakdown of hemoglobin produces a bright green pigment known as sulfhemoglobin.
So it's basically green blood pigment.
That visible greening on the skin is the definitive biological flag that the bacterial invasion has successfully breached the surface.
From that initial beachhead in the right iliac fossa, the bacteria don't just slowly crawl inch by inch through dense, solid muscle tissue. They utilize the body's own pre-existing infrastructure to spread rapidly.
They utilize the vascular highways. The extensive network of blood vessels provides a perfectly connected, low-resistance, fluid-filled network for the bacteria to spread rapidly and systemically throughout the entire body.
Following the veins.
As these bacterial colonies travel outward through the superficial veins just under the skin, they continue to metabolize and decompose the hemoglobin within those vessels.
Which creates a very specific pattern.
This creates a highly visible, branching, linear pattern of dark discoloration on the skin's surface. This phenomenon is termed marbling. It literally looks as though the veins of a dark marble stone have been mapped out across the skin in striking patterns of dark greens, deep purples, and eventually black.
While this spectacular visual change is happening internally and mapping itself on the skin, the structural integrity of the skin itself is failing entirely.
The superficial outer layers of the epidermis begin to completely lose their cellular cohesion to the underlying deeper dermis.
This leads to skin slippage.
This leads to a phenomenon we call skin slippage, where even gentle pressure or the friction of attempting to move the body can cause large intact sheets of skin, including the hair and nails, to simply slide away from the underlying tissue like a loose glove.
That sounds intense.
Simultaneously, as the tissues break down, large blisters or bullae begin to form on the surface of the skin. These are not clear blisters like a burn. They are filled with a dark, opaque red or brown, profoundly foul-smelling putrefaction fluid.
And then the body enters the bloating phase, a process driven entirely by the accumulation of internal gas.
As the billions of bacteria aggressively consume the carbohydrate and protein-rich tissues, their metabolic processes produce massive quantities of various gases, primarily hydrogen sulfide, methane, carbon dioxide, and ammonia.
Which has nowhere to go.
Because the skin, even while slipping, remains somewhat elastic and relatively impermeable, this massive volume of gas accumulates and becomes trapped within the soft tissues and the major body cavities. The body begins to swell dramatically and aggressively.
Extremely aggressively.
The face, the abdomen, the breasts, and the male genitals undergo profound distorting bloating. The visual distortion is so extreme, puffing out the cheeks and distending the lips, that the individual often becomes entirely visually unidentifiable even to their closest family members within a matter of days.
The internal pressure generated by all this trapped putrefactive gas is immense, and it leads to a very specific, dangerous medico-legal trap that crime scene investigators must be acutely aware of.
The immense gas pressure literally forces internal anatomical structures to shift and displace. The eyes are pushed forward and forced to protrude outwards from the sockets. The tongue swells and is forced out past the teeth.
But the real trap happens with the lungs.
Critically, the immense pressure building up inside the abdominal cavity pushes upward against the diaphragm, violently compressing the lungs and the chest cavity. This compression forces the accumulating fluids, the decomposing, liquefying tissues of the lungs, heavily mixed with broken-down blood upward through the trachea, where it leaks actively out of the mouth and the nose.
This specific dark bloody fluid is clinically called purge fluid.
Yes. And because purge fluid is dark red, heavily bloodstained, and often bubbling due to the escaping gas, to an inexperienced investigator, a panicked first responder, or a family member discovering the body, it looks exactly like the victim suffered a massive traumatic perimortem hemorrhage.
It looks like they were beaten.
It perfectly mimics the copious blood you might expect to see flowing from a severe blunt force beating to the head, a fractured skull, or an internal gunshot wound.
Misinterpreting normal, expected post-mortem purge fluid as a definitive sign of perimortem violence is a classic, catastrophic error at a death scene that can launch a completely unwarranted homicide investigation.
A trained forensic pathologist knows to carefully wipe away the fluid and look for actual structural lacerations, bullet holes, or bone fractures beneath the purge. But the initial visual impact of a bloody face is highly deceptive.
It's a complete biological metamorphosis. But the textbook points out that not everything in the body breaks down at the exact same rate. Some organs are surprisingly resilient.
The internal progression of putrefaction is highly uneven. Organs with high water content and delicate structures like the brain, the stomach, and the liver often liquefy very quickly, sometimes within days.
But other organs last longer.
However, dense, compact, fibromuscular organs are remarkably resistant to bacterial breakdown. The prostate gland in males and the non-gravid, meaning non-pregnant uterus in females, can survive the putrefactive process and remain structurally identifiable for many months, even after the rest of the surrounding soft tissue has completely liquefied into a dark paste.
And tendons, too.
Dense connective tissues like tendons and heavy ligaments also persist for a long time. This is vital forensically because discovering an intact prostate or an intact uterus amidst heavily decomposed, otherwise unidentifiable remains can immediately definitively confirm the biological sex of the individual.
Which drastically narrows down the parameters for long-term identification efforts and missing persons databases.
It's an essential starting point.
This entire detailed timeline of putrefaction we just discussed implicitly assumes a body is lying relatively exposed, perhaps on a bed or a forest floor, in a standard temperate climate. But the surrounding environment changes absolutely everything about that timeline. Let's move to Section 6. Environmental modifiers, focusing on immersion in water, burial in earth, and the extreme pathways of natural preservation.
The environment dictates the speed, the severity, and ultimately the entire nature of the chemical reactions of decomposition. In forensic pathology, we utilize a historical rule of thumb called Casper's law, or Casper's ratio, to help conceptualize how different environments aggressively retard or alter the rate of decomposition.
Right. Casper's law states that if all other biological variables are equal, 1 week of decomposition occurring in the open air is roughly equivalent to 2 weeks of decomposition if the body is fully immersed in water.
Which in turn is roughly equivalent to 8 weeks of decomposition if the body is buried deep within the earth. It's a 1:2 to 8 ratio. Air, water, earth.
It is a sweeping generalization, and no pathologist relies on it for exact math, but it provides a very useful conceptual framework for understanding environmental impact.
Immersion in water drastically slows down normal decomposition, primarily because the temperatures of lakes, rivers, or oceans are generally significantly lower than average ambient air temperatures, which massively slows down the bacterial metabolism driving putrefaction.
Cold slows down the bacteria.
Immersion also fundamentally alters the availability of oxygen, which changes the types of bacteria that can thrive.
When a body is recovered from a body of water, the text highlights the extreme importance of understanding the typical aquatic body position.
When a human body initially drowns or is thrown into water, it usually sinks. Once it loses all muscle tone and enters flaccidity, it adopts a very specific posture dictated entirely by internal buoyancy and the varying density of body parts.
So they don't just float flat.
The chest and abdomen, which contain air in the lungs and later accumulate decomposition gases in the bowel, tend to be the most buoyant and float highest. The head, which is heavily weighted by the dense bone of the skull and the brain, and the limbs, which are dense muscle and bone, drop downwards.
So they float face down, hunched over.
Therefore, a submerged body typically floats face down in a somewhat curled, fetal, or hunched position, with the top of the heavy head, the backs of the hands, and the prominent kneecaps hanging lowest, pointing down towards the riverbed or the seabed.
And as the water currents push and roll that submerged body along, those specific low-hanging dependent areas drag continuously against the rocks, sand, and debris on the bottom.
Precisely. This continuous abrasive dragging causes very specific patterned scrape marks and deep abrasions primarily on the forehead, the knuckles, the backs of the hands, and the knees.
Which look like injuries.
The vital and often highly difficult forensic task here is distinguishing these post-mortem aquatic artifacts from pre-immersion assault. Deep, ragged abrasions on the forehead caused by the body bouncing along a rocky riverbed for 3 days can look almost identical to a brutal blunt force trauma inflicted with a weapon right before the victim was thrown into the water.
You also have to factor in the impact of the aquatic ecosystem itself, specifically marine life.
Yes, marine predation can be rapid and visually devastating. Small fish, crabs, sea lice, and crustaceans will actively feed on the soft, exposed tissues of the body, particularly targeting the delicate tissues of the face, the lips, the eyelids, and the extremities.
Which looks horrific.
The resulting severe, irregular tissue loss must not be confused by an investigator with intentional perimortem human mutilation or torture. Furthermore, the first major physical change observed in water immersion is the complete maceration, the extreme softening and wrinkling and eventual sloughing off of the epidermis, especially on the hands and feet.
Like when you sit in the bath too long.
Exactly, but extreme. Eventually, as enough putrefactive gas builds up internally, the bloated body will overcome its density and rise to the surface. But the timing of that refloating is wildly variable, depending heavily on water temperature and depth.
Now, sometimes the specific conditions of the environment halt typical bacterial putrefaction entirely and force the body down a highly specialized alternative pathway of chemical alteration. Let's look closely at the formation of adipose hair.
A process also known as saponification.
Saponification is, quite literally, the chemical process of making soap.
It is. When a body is deposited in a wet, highly moist, largely anaerobic environment, such as being submerged deeply in a cold lake or buried in very dense, waterlogged, clay-heavy soil, the normal gas-producing bacterial putrefaction is stifled due to the lack of oxygen and the lower temperature.
So what happens instead?
Instead, the body fat undergoes a slow, complex chemical hydrolysis. The abundant triglycerides present in the body's adipose tissue are chemically converted into free fatty acids.
And this conversion creates adipose hair. For a student trying to visualize this, what does adipose actually look and feel like as it develops?
In its very early stages of formation, it is an incredibly unpleasant substance. It presents as a pale, profoundly rancid, greasy, semi-fluid paste. The smell is incredibly distinct, penetrating, and unforgettable.
But then it changes.
But as the hydrolysis process slowly progresses over a period of weeks or months, the substance dehydrates and hardens. Fully formed, mature adipose is a firm, grayish-white, brittle, waxy substance that essentially forms a thick, hard, protective shell around the remains.
Like wax.
Because it is so firm and structurally stable, it actually preserves the gross anatomical shape of the body, and incredibly, it can preserve recognizable facial features and the outlines of trauma long after the underlying muscles and internal organs have completely liquefied and decayed away.
It's almost as if the body's own fat casts a hard wax statue of itself.
That is an excellent, accurate analogy. It can take many weeks to several months to form completely, although partial formation has been reported in forensic literature in as little as 3 to 4 weeks under ideal, warm, damp conditions.
And it needs water to form.
And interestingly, while it fundamentally requires moisture to fuel the hydrolysis, it has occasionally been found occurring in bodies sealed inside dry, lead-lined burial vaults.
How is that possible?
In those rare cases, the internal water content of the body itself was sufficient to drive the chemical conversion of the fat.
The absolute opposite extreme of that wet, waxy preservation is mummification.
Mummification is the direct physiological result of extreme, rapid desiccation. It requires a profoundly dry environment. The classic archetypal example is a body buried shallowly in the hot, shifting, dry sands of a desert.
It bakes the water out.
The intense environmental heat and the absolute total lack of moisture bake the water out of the body's tissues so rapidly that the putrefactive bacteria, which require a wet environment to multiply, simply cannot survive or establish themselves to break the body down.
But the textbook makes a crucial, highly relevant medico-legal point. Mummification isn't a phenomenon restricted solely to the Sahara Desert. It can happen in very specific, cold microenvironments as well.
Yes, recognizing this is a vital medical legal skill, particularly in urban environments. A cold, exceedingly dry environment with a strong, continuous flow of air, a draft, can desiccate a small body just as effectively as desert heat.
Like where?
The textbook specifically notes the tragic but forensically common scenario of newborn infants or small children whose bodies are concealed within the walls or beneath the floorboards of a drafty older house.
The air just pulls the moisture out.
The continuous, cool, dry air moving through that confined microenvironment causes the small mass of the infant's body to rapidly lose its moisture and completely mummify before the bacteria can initiate rot.
And mummification strongly favors thin individuals, correct? Because there is less dense body mass and less insulating, water-retaining fat to slow down the drying process. What does fully mummified human tissue actually look like?
The tissue becomes completely devoid of moisture. It turns dry, incredibly tough, leathery, and usually takes on a dark brown or almost black coloration. The skin shrinks dramatically, pulling incredibly tight across the underlying skeletal structure, prominently revealing the bones of the face and the ribs.
And it lasts a long time.
Because it is so thoroughly dry, it is entirely immune to standard bacterial decay. However, mummified remains are highly susceptible to an entirely different type of environmental degradation, intense insect predation by specific dry tissue scavengers.
Beetles and moths.
Certain species of beetles and the larvae of the brown house moth will actively inhabit the remains and literally eat the dried, preserved protein of the skin and hair over time.
Eventually, regardless of the pathway, whether through the wet destruction of putrefaction, the eventual long-term crumbling of adipocere, or the slow insect consumption of mummified tissue, we inevitably reach the final, enduring stage of post-mortem change, skeletalization.
The timeline required for complete skeletalization is highly variable, entirely dependent on the depth of the burial, the acidity of the soil, and the climate. But as a broad, general forensic rule, if an adult body is buried in a standard coffin or directly in average earth, the soft tissues will be almost entirely absent, consumed by bacteria and insects, by approximately 2 years.
2 years to skeleton.
By about 5 years of burial, the bones will be completely bare of any soft tissue and will typically be disarticulated, meaning the tough ligaments that hold the joints together have finally failed and rotted away, and the skeleton has fallen apart into individual, separate bones.
But even at that 5-year mark, a forensic anthropologist isn't dealing with dry, dusty, pristine white museum bones, right?
No, not at all. Even at 5 years, the bones still retain a significant amount of biological organic material deep within the porous spongy bone and the marrow cavity. They will still feel slightly greasy to the touch, and they may retain a faint odor.
They still have life in them, so to speak.
And critically, if a forensic pathologist or an anthropologist has to physically cut the bone with a high-speed oscillating autopsy saw to perform an analysis, the intense friction of the blade will actively burn that remaining organic protein inside the marrow.
You can actually smell it burning.
This produces a distinct, visible wisp of smoke and a very noticeable, acrid smell of burning hair or protein, confirming the bones are not entirely dry or ancient.
Let's talk about the science of dating bones, because this is where the medical intersects with the pragmatic needs of the law. If a hiker finds a human skull half buried in the woods, the police urgently need to know if they're looking for a murderer who dumped a body last year, or if they've stumbled upon the grave of a pioneer from 1850.
The modern medico-legal interest in found human remains generally fades entirely once it is scientifically established that the bones are older than approximately 70 to 80 years.
Why is that the cutoff?
Because the criminal justice system is entirely pragmatic. If the victim died 80 years ago, the perpetrator of the crime is almost certainly dead as well, rendering a police investigation and a criminal trial functionally impossible.
So how do we definitively prove they are older than 70 years? Everyone who watches documentaries assumes we just use carbon-14 dating.
Carbon-14 radiocarbon dating is an incredibly powerful tool for archaeology, perfect for measuring the age of artifacts over thousands of years. But its radioactive half-life is simply too long, and its margin of error too wide to accurately differentiate between a bone from a victim murdered in 1920 and a bone from a victim murdered in 1990.
It's just not precise enough for modern forensics.
For these crucial forensic timescales, we look for modern, man-made atomic markers embedded in the bone. Specifically, we look for the radioactive isotope strontium-90.
Which comes directly from nuclear weapons testing.
Yes, strontium-90 is a synthetic isotope that simply did not exist anywhere in the natural global environment prior to the detonation of the first atomic bombs and the subsequent era of rampant atmospheric nuclear testing that began in the mid-1940s.
So how does it get into the bones?
Because strontium chemically mimics calcium, human bodies inadvertently absorb it from the environment and incorporate it deep into their growing bone structure. Therefore, if a forensic anthropologist analyzes a sample of a discovered bone and finds absolutely zero trace of strontium-90 within its matrix, they can confidently state that the individual died and their bones stopped absorbing environmental minerals prior to 1945.
It's a definitive cutoff.
It provides a definitive, unarguable, chronological dividing line that helps rapidly clear older historical remains from the overburdened modern medical legal system.
This highlights beautifully how incredibly interdisciplinary forensic science must be. Which brings us perfectly to our final main segment, Section 7, Integration, Artifacts, and Medico-Legal Humility. We need to talk about the vital high-stakes skill of differentiating post-mortem injuries, damage that happens after death, from perimortem trauma, the injuries that actually killed the person.
A dead body, once left in an environment, is simply an organic object in that environment, and it is subjected to the harsh physical realities of that space. It can be violently damaged by animal scavengers, battered by severe weather, or inadvertently mutilated by the heavy machinery or tools used by emergency services to recover it.
So it's hard to tell what killed them.
The pathologist bears the immense responsibility of determining if the jagged hole in a body's chest was caused by a shotgun blast that murdered them, or by a large rat that chewed through the softening skin 3 days after they died of a heart attack.
We mentioned animal and insect predation earlier. Rats, blowflies, crabs. We also mentioned boat propellers causing massive aquatic trauma. What is the central anchor, the key clinical biological difference between a wound inflicted while the person was alive and struggling and a wound inflicted after the heart has stopped?
The primary physiological distinction relies entirely on the presence of a living, actively pumping circulatory system and a functioning immune system. Post-mortem wounds inflicted after cardiac arrest do not actively bleed.
Because there's no pressure.
Because there is no blood pressure, the severed vessels do not spurt. They might passively leak a small amount of pooled dark blood, especially if the post-mortem wound is situated on a highly vascular dependent area like the scalp where lividity has settled, or if the body is recovered from water where the macerated tissue oozes fluid. But they will absolutely not exhibit the forceful, pressurized, bright red hemorrhage characteristic of a living arterial cut.
And if we look closer, at a microscopic cellular level.
Macroscopically and microscopically, post-mortem wounds generally completely lack the vital rim of an early inflammatory response. When living tissue is injured, the body immediately mounts a defense. It sends white blood cells, plasma, and fluid to the precise edges of the wound, causing visible swelling, redness, and microscopic cellular infiltration.
Dead tissue can't do that.
Dead tissue, lacking circulation, cannot mount this biological response. The edges of a post-mortem wound will look pale, dry, and lack that red, swollen, inflammatory border.
But there's a massive, highly contested gray area here, isn't there?
A profoundly dangerous and legally contentious gray area. The absolute lack of an inflammatory response confirms one of two things. Either the tissue was already dead when the injury occurred, or it confirms that the fatal injury was inflicted in the very final moments, the last few agonizing seconds of life, before the body had the physical time to mount a measurable inflammatory response before cardiac arrest halted the process.
So it's basically impossible to tell sometimes.
Differentiating a stab wound inflicted 10 seconds before death from a stab wound inflicted 10 minutes after death can be pathologically impossible based on the morphological appearance of the wound alone.
To illustrate just how unbelievably high the stakes are when experts ignore these gray areas and overinterpret biological variables, the textbook provides a chilling, foundational case study. Let's delve deeply into the Stephen Truscott case outlined in Box 5.4.
The Stephen Truscott case is arguably one of the most important foundational lessons in forensic humility in the modern era. In 1959, in rural Ontario, Canada, a 12-year-old girl named Lynn Harper went missing. Days later, she was found murdered, having been strangled in a local woodland area.
And they accused a local boy.
A 14-year-old local boy, Stephen Truscott, who was known to have given her a ride on the handlebars of his bicycle the evening where she vanished, was accused of the crime, tried as an adult, convicted of murder, and unbelievably sentenced to be executed by hanging, though that sentence was later commuted to life in prison.
And the entire prosecution case, the evidence that put a 14-year-old boy on death row, essentially hung on one incredibly specific, rigid forensic estimation regarding the time of death.
The case hinged almost entirely on the highly confident analysis of the victim's gastric contents. During the autopsy, the medical examiner found recognizable food particles, specifically vegetable matter, and what appeared to be meat remaining in her stomach.
So they looked at her last meal.
The forensic experts testifying for the prosecution stated that, based on their understanding of standard average gastric emptying times, the rate at which a stomach digests food and moves it into the intestine, the presence of this specific amount of undigested food meant Lynn Harper absolutely must have died exactly between 1.5 and 2 hours after she finished her last known meal, which was a dinner at home.
They literally used the digestion of her stomach contents like a precise mechanical stopwatch to pinpoint the murder.
Exactly. They established a rigid 30-minute window for the murder based on the digestion of a meal. And because Stephen Truscott, by his own admission, was known to be with her, giving her a bike ride during that exact, incredibly narrow 30-minute window before parting ways, the prosecution successfully argued to the jury that he had exclusive opportunity to commit the murder.
And the jury believed them.
The jury, faced with confident experts claiming scientific certainty about the stomach contents, believed the science. A 14-year-old boy was condemned based on the digestion rate of vegetables.
But the science they presented with such certainty wasn't certain at all, was it?
It was catastrophically, fundamentally flawed. Gastric emptying is not a mechanical clock. It is an intensely complex biological process influenced by immense, unpredictable variables.
Like what?
The fat content of the meal drastically slows digestion. The physical consistency of the food matters. But most importantly, the emotional state of the individual profoundly impacts the gastrointestinal tract. If a person experiences sudden fear, extreme stress, or trauma, their sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight response activates,
which shuts down digestion entirely.
This activation instantly shuts down non-essential bodily functions, including digestion. A heavy, stressful meal, or a meal eaten right before a terrifying event, might remain completely undigested in the stomach for many, many hours.
Truscott maintained his innocence for decades. His conviction was finally officially quashed in 2007.
Yes, nearly 50 years after the trial, the appellate courts formally recognized what modern forensic pathology demands we accept as truth. Gastric emptying times are so highly variable, so susceptible to emotion and biology, that they can never be utilized as a reliable, standalone marker to pinpoint a specific post-mortem interval.
You can't base a life on it.
The physical presence of food in the stomach can be useful to corroborate a witness's statement about what a person ate for their last meal, but it cannot, under any circumstances, tell you exactly when they died. The overwhelming hubris of the 1959 experts, treating a highly variable biological process as a rigid mathematical fact, cost an innocent man his entire life and freedom.
Which is precisely why modern death investigation relies on bringing in multiple diverse disciplines to corroborate a timeline, rather than relying on one variable, for instance, forensic entomology. Instead of just looking inside the body's digestive tract, we look at the ecosystem that arrived from the outside.
Forensic entomology is an incredibly powerful independent tool because insects operate on relatively predictable, highly temperature-dependent biological life cycles. The primary, most forensically relevant actors in this ecosystem are the blowflies, specifically the family Calliphoridae.
Walk us through the specific life cycle of the blowfly, because understanding those stages is exactly how the entomologist builds their timeline of death.
Within mere hours and sometimes minutes of death occurring, female blowflies will detect the subtle chemical odors of early decomposition and arrive at the body. They actively seek out moist, protected areas to deposit their eggs.
Like the eyes and nose.
Typically, they lay these eggs in the natural orifices of the face, the eyes, the nose, the mouth, and the ears. Crucially, they will also heavily target any open, actively bleeding wounds.
So as an investigator, if you examine a body and find massive, concentrated maggot activity right in the center of the chest, but relatively little activity on the face, it strongly suggests there was an open wound on the chest, perhaps a stab wound, that drew the flies there first.
Exactly. It's a vital indirect clue pointing toward perimortem trauma that might be obscured by decay. Once the eggs are laid in these moist areas, they hatch into small larvae, which we commonly call maggots. These larvae undergo 3 distinct phases of rapid growth, which entomologists call instars.
And they shed their skin between them.
They shed their outer skin, or molt, between each instar phase as they aggressively feed on the decomposing soft tissue. Once the maggot reaches the end of the 3rd instar, it is fully developed. It entirely stops feeding, migrates away from the wet, decaying remains into the surrounding dry soil, leaf litter, or the folds of the victim's clothing, and forms a hard, dark, protective shell called a puparium.
Like a cocoon.
Inside this rigid shell, it undergoes metamorphosis, and eventually a new adult, winged fly emerges to restart the cycle.
And because a highly trained entomologist knows exactly how long it takes a specific species of blowfly to progress from an egg to a 3rd instar maggot or to an empty pupal casing at a given ambient temperature, they can calculate the minimum amount of time that body must have been lying dead and exposed to the environment.
Yes, they calculate the minimum post-mortem interval. But again, notice the profound reliance on ambient temperature. The growth of the maggots is entirely dependent on the heat of their environment. The entomologist requires exhaustive, incredibly detailed ecological and meteorological data from the exact scene, including historical temperature logs, shade cover, and rainfall, to make their calculations accurate.
It's a huge collaborative effort.
It is a highly collaborative, deeply interdisciplinary effort, not a magic trick performed in isolation.
So, we have covered an immense amount of ground today. What does this all mean for the practitioner? We've journeyed from the exact second the heart stops, through the rapid nervous system shutdown, the cellular locking of rigor mortis, the gravitational pooling of livor mortis, the complex thermal decline of Algor mortis, and the Hin's nomogram. We've explored the bacterial destruction of putrefaction, the chemical preservation of adipocere, and the eventual reduction of the body to bare, strontium-tested bone.
What it means, practically and professionally, is that we must integrate every single data point. A forensic practitioner must synthesize the internal pathology of the organs, the physiological variables of the individual, the environmental findings of the crime scene, and the rigorous constraints of the law.
Everything has to connect.
The central, unavoidable takeaway from Simpson's Chapter 5 is that Livor, Rigor, and Algor mortis are incredibly vital clinical signs. We must observe them meticulously and document them flawlessly. But their extreme, inherent biological variability demands absolute scientific humility. A professional must never let a single post-mortem sign, a single calculation on a nomogram, or a single handful of undigested food override common sense, scene context, and the fundamental reality that human biology is beautifully, frustratingly chaotic.
I want to leave you with a final, slightly provocative thought to mull over as we wrap up this intense deep dive. Consider this. The microbiome inside your body right this very second, the billions of commensal bacteria quietly helping you digest your lunch and maintain your health, are not just passive passengers.
They're simply waiting.
They are, in a very real biological sense, simply waiting patiently for your immune system to finally pause, for your heart to stop, so that they can immediately step up and become the primary architects of your own decomposition. The biological ecosystem doesn't end when you die, it just changes management.
A stark, but biologically perfect way to summarize the entire process.
I highly encourage you, whether you're a student or a seasoned doctor, to go read Chapter 5 of Simpson's Forensic Medicine. Internalize the physiological mechanisms we discussed.
It will cement everything we just talked about.
But before you log off, let's anchor these core concepts to ensure you are exam and practice ready. We are going to do a rapid learning reinforcement session. I will ask a single best answer style prompt. I'll pause for a moment to let you think of the answer, and then the expert will give the correct response and tell you which specific section of the chapter to review if you struggled. Ready?
Let's do it.
Prompt 1. An investigator examines a body found lying face down on a mattress. They observe intense pink-purple discoloration on the anterior surface of the body, but note distinct, stark white patches across the prominent cheekbones, the tip of the nose, and the chest. What specific post-mortem phenomenon does this pallor represent?
The answer is contact pallor, or relative pallor within hypostasis. This is caused directly by the physical compression of the superficial capillary beds against a firm surface, in this case the mattress, which physically prevents the gravitational pooling of red blood cells in those specific compressed areas. If you need to review the mechanics of this, revisit the section on post-mortem hypostasis.
Prompt 2. At a microscopic cellular level, which specific biochemical change is the primary driver for the development and locking of rigor mortis?
The precise answer is the profound depletion of cellular ATP combined with rising intracellular acidity, specifically lactic acid, resulting from the cell shift to anoxic respiration. This toxic low-energy environment causes the actin and myosin protein filaments to irrevocably bind and form a rigid gel. Review the precise mechanism in the section on rigor mortis.
Prompt 3. A body is recovered from the bedroom of a house following a severe structural fire. Upon external examination, the pathologist notes deep, extremely bright cherry pink lividity. Based on this visual cue, what specific toxicological profile is most strongly suspected?
The answer is acute carbon monoxide poisoning. The inhalation of the gas leads to the formation of carboxyhemoglobin, which creates this distinct, highly stable cherry pink coloration in the gravitationally settled blood. Review the toxicological variations detailed within postmortem hypostasis.
Prompt 4. According to the historical forensic rule of thumb known as Casper's Law, if a body takes exactly 1 week to reach a certain visual state of decomposition in the open air, approximately how long would it take to reach that exact same state if the body had been buried deep in the earth?
The answer is 8 weeks. The historical Casper's ratio is roughly 1 to 2 to 8, representing the relative speed of decomposition in air, water, and earth, respectively. If you struggled with this environmental concept, review the section on immersion and burial.
Prompt 5. During standard putrefaction in a temperate climate, the very first externally visible sign of decay is usually a localized green discoloration on the abdomen. Which specific anatomical quadrant of the abdomen is most commonly affected first, and anatomically, why does it start there?
The answer is the right iliac fossa, or the lower right quadrant. This specific location is affected first due to the anatomical proximity of the highly bacteria-rich cecum to the superficial abdominal wall, allowing the escaping commensal gut bacteria to rapidly breach the tissue and degrade the local hemoglobin into green self-hemoglobin. Review the initial stages in the section on decomposition and putrefaction.
Prompt 6. The Hensed nomogram is widely used to estimate the postmortem interval via body cooling. Which 3 primary precise variables must be inputted into the nomogram first before applying any corrective factors for clothing or water?
The 3 required variables are the core body temperature of the deceased, typically taken via the rectum, the precise ambient scene temperature taken at the time of discovery, and the body weight of the deceased. Review the variables and extreme limitations of this tool in the section on the estimation of the postmortem interval.
Excellent work. That concludes our extensive deep dive into the appearance of the body after death. Keep studying the mechanisms, keep questioning the biological variables, and never stop demanding scientific humility. We'll see you next time.